Hello, everyone, and welcome to another curatorial lecture here at the Walters Art Museum. My name is Joy Davis, and I'm the Adult and Community Programs Manager here at the Walters. This evening, I have the pleasure of introducing Christine Sciacca, Associate Curator of European Art from 300 to 1400 CE. Christine has an interest in feasting via her work on the exhibition Eat, Drink, and Be Merry, Food in the Middle Ages and Renaissance at the J. Paul Getty Museum in 2015. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you so much, Joy, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on one of my favorite topics, medieval food, actually food in general, but for now we'll just stick to medieval food for this presentation.
Awesome.
So one of the most intriguing pieces in the Walters collection for me is this small bronze boat that you see on the screen. It's about 3 3/4 inches high and 5.5 inches in length. And it was likely made in either Germany or the Netherlands around the year 1400. It has many of the details one would find on an actual ship from the time period in which it was made. And I show one example of the roughly contemporary ship shown in a detail from a recently restored painting on view in the Walters collection. And it's showing the departure of Helen of Troy for Cythera. And this is a wonderful research interest of my colleague, Joni Spicer at the Walters. On the spice cellar, if you look closely, you can see that the hull, or the lower part of the ship that sits in the water, is ridged. So it has the look of being constructed from wood planks, even though here, of course, in the case of our object, this sculpture is cast bronze. It has a raised aft deck, which has been very delicately decorated around its perimeter with cutout fleur-de-lis and quatrefoils. And the deck is topped with 2 small towers. Now, these motifs are far more commonly found in small-scale medieval metalwork than in ships, so the craftsman is taking a bit of creative license here in the decoration of the boat. Nonetheless, if we look at this detail from the Helen of Troy painting, you can see that some of the perimeters of the wood decks on that ship are actually also decorated and pierced with quatrefoil, so it's not in some ways too far from the truth. In the case of the spice cellar, just below the deck level, as it were, there's a cavity that likely would have been used to hold condiments, like spices, or perhaps even salt. Now, typically, medieval spice cellars would also have had a lid to protect its contents from contamination and from spills. In the case of the Walters example, however, there's no lid and no attachment for one. This is what our conservators have found. But the latter could have actually worn off over time, but there's nothing that exists there today. In medieval Europe, spices were highly prized, and since spices that they used, such as pepper and cinnamon, cardamom and ginger, had to be imported from places like China and India and the Middle East, you can imagine that they were incredibly costly. And so the use of them really marked the consumer's very high social status and wealth. So if you had these on your table, that was a mark of your great wealth and your ability to buy these materials. Our spice cellar would have been one object among the dishware and servingware of the well-appointed medieval table, both contributing to the decoration of the table and also the display of the food. And I show here an image of the feast at the house of Simon the Pharisee from the Stein quadriptych at the Walters. This is a collection of manuscript leaves that have been assembled into a kind of what looks like a panel painting or a multi-paneled altarpiece. But in fact, each square that you see here is a painted illumination on parchment. Now, while the scene that you look at here is drawn from events from the Bible, the artist, Simon Benning, has outfitted the table with dishware that would have been typical of the Netherlandish table around the year 1500, so exactly where this manuscript comes from, so not at all from biblical times. You can see, for example, the 2 tankards in the foreground, and also at the center of the table, what looks like an open salt cellar. It's very tiny. It looks almost like a tiny chalice, but you could see the white at the center of that cup. Perhaps the most famous image from around the same date as the Walters Spice Cellar that depicts a medieval banquet is the January calendar page from the Très Riche of Jean-Duc de Berry, or also known as the Very Rich Book of Hours of John, Duke of Berry. Medieval calendars found in such types of manuscripts as books of hours often depicted the labors of the months. And in January, in Northern Europe, where this manuscript was made, you can imagine that it's so cold that all you can really do at that time is warm your feet by the fire and eat the fruits of your farms to fatten yourself up against the cold. So displaying all of the meats produced by animal husbandry and fruits and vegetables that would have been grown throughout the warmer months. In the detail from this scene, you can see the portrait of Jean-Duc de Berry in a furry hat, obviously keeping himself warm. It looks like they're having an outside banquet, and he's wearing this rich blue robe with gold details. Now, just next to his left elbow is a very large gold vessel, which is actually a salt cellar shaped like a ship, and it's placed on a tall pedestal. As you can see from this image, for medieval banquets in noble or wealthy households, this meal could be as much about the spectacle of the event as it was about the food itself. The servers, the table display, the entertainment, all of these things came together to make for a really remarkable event that would have been remembered by its guests and, of course, also its host. Accoutrements for the table were meant to impress the guests, inspire conversation, and also could have been the jumping off points for games played between the diners. And entertainment was even built into the food itself sometimes. Many of you will be familiar with the nursery rhyme, "Sing a Song of Sixpence." And if you really listen to the words, or if you ever have done this, you might have wondered at its origins. And if you don't know it, it goes like this. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. Wasn't that a dainty dish to set before the king? So this nursery rhyme is actually referring to what is known as an entremet, a sort of in-between course in the medieval banquet and also in later time periods that grew into a form of entertainment. As one of these documented entremets in the 16th century was actually one in which live blackbirds were baked into a savory pie, so that when the host of the meal, or who could have been, for example, a king, when the host cut into it, the birds would fly out, surprising and delighting the guests. So it's almost a fake food. You look at this scrumptious pie and you get very excited that you're going to eat it. And then the further surprise comes when it's actually not, in fact, edible. It's filled with these live birds. Returning to the Walters Spice Cellar, I wanted to spend a few moments talking about the shape of the vessel. Of all the forms that a spice container could take, why a boat? Perhaps it finds its roots in an earlier tradition of ship-shaped vessels, such as incense holders used in the Christian Mass. And I show you here an incense boat in the Walters collection in gilded bronze with Champlevé enamel decoration. It has a hinge at the center of the lid so that one side, or perhaps both, could be lifted up and the incense scooped out and added to the censer. This type of vessel is sometimes referred to by its Latin name, navicula, or sometimes a navette. One of the Walters prayer books, W164, and I show that image just next to the incense holder, it illustrates a boat-shaped incense boat actually in use. This boat could have sat on an altar until it was needed to fill the incense burner, or here we see a cleric holding the navette in one hand and censing the altar with an incense burner as various relics hang above the altar. This image comes before a prayer dedicated to church relics, and so we see the use of fragrant incense to venerate and honor the remains of saints and holy people. Another example, also from mid-13th century France, is this salt cellar in the collection of the Cloisters Museum in New York. Again, it takes an even more boat-like form, and it has a lid. But the workmanship is really quite different here. The boat part is actually constructed from carved rock crystal, set into a gold frame, which is in turn studded with gemstones and pearls. The vessel is set atop a gold stand that might remind one of the foot of a chalice, and yet this would have been used on a banquet table in a wealthy household. Closer to the end of the 16th century, so jumping about 3 centuries forward in time, these table ships, also referred to as nefs, became quite elaborate. For example, I show you here the Burghley nef, also constructed in Paris, and now in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It's outfitted with the details one would expect from an actual seaworthy ship. It has masts, flags, a figurehead, etc. Also during this time period in the 16th century, there was a great interest in automata. So there's a famous example of the nef automaton of Charles V. It's a very elaborate gold-clad boat which had a mechanism inside that could propel it across the table during a meal. There's also another theory about why the boat shape was adopted for the medieval European spice cellar beyond liturgical use of the boat-shaped incense boat. Spices and incense were products foreign to Europe, as I mentioned before, and they had to be imported along various trade routes from the south and the east of Europe. And at some point in their journey, they had to travel by boat. Ships, because of the means by which Europe obtained substances that to them were precious and rare, you had to obviously, there was an immediate association with spices and boats. In addition, Christina Normore has noted the connection between the salt water sailed by ocean vessels and the origins of the substance of salt itself. Now, the Walters example is nowhere near as elaborate or intricate as, for example, the Burghley nef. However, many late medieval salt and spice cellars were stationary. All the ones that I've shown you so far have been. The fact that the Walters spice cellar is on wheels is, I think, what makes it so remarkable. And now I'm going to shift out of my slides, if I can. And move on to some visual aids. So now, since I don't have the actual Walters spice cellar to hand, I asked my 4-year-old to construct a model of a boat on wheels from one of her building sets. So I have that here today. A wealthy medieval household would have had a spice cellar on any well-appointed table, just much like it's the standard to have on the American table salt and pepper shakers. So I have here a couple of examples in my own collection given to me by two different, very dear friends. Salt and pepper shakers, I think in at least the 20th century in America, were collectibles. And so I know more than one person who has a whole collection of such things. And I have a couple of these, like I said, vintage examples here, sort of mid-century modern examples. Just as the medieval spice cellar would have been a point of conversation among diners, this is also the function of these various sorts of salt and pepper shakers that have been collected over time in America. And I think this is so much more true of a kinetic sculpture or a kinetic spice cellar, like the Walters ship-shaped spice cellar. Guests could look at it and delight in the craftsmanship and converse about it, not only because it was, interesting and it moved around, but it's an adorable miniature ship. Let's take it for what it is. So now I'm going to just shift things away and I'll show you how the spice cellar would have worked. Because the Walters spice cellar moved, you can imagine guests sort of passing it down the table from one to the other. You can imagine sort of almost a tennis game up and down a banquet table as guests rolled the ship between each other, seasoning their food along the way. So when I look at the design of that, and I think about the movement of this very precious object that we have in our collection, I do wonder if the Walters Spice Cellar, we've come to land on a possible origin for the term "please pass the salt." So those are what I have to say right now. I'm happy to entertain questions, and I'm glad to have Joy back here to help me out with that.
It doesn't look like we have questions yet, but I really welcome folks to engage in the conversation. I do have a couple of questions for you. I was curious, what intrigues you about feasting? It can be very specific, but it can be such a broad topic in human history. And so I'm wondering what drew you to the subject.
I mean, really, it's what I said at the beginning. I'm kind of a bit of a foodie, so was interested to see sort of how food was considered in the Middle Ages. I think we have a very perhaps incorrect concept of food in the Middle Ages, that it was, they ate all of 3 food items and everything was bland and everything was rotten all the time. And I think that's not true, or else we wouldn't be here today, because they wouldn't have survived on a diet like that in medieval Europe. So I'm certainly much more limited than what we have access to today. We have foods from all around the world at our fingertips in America all the time, very easy to access. So but if you were of a certain social class in Europe in the Middle Ages, you could import various sorts of things from all over the place. You had highly trained cooks who were very protective of their recipes, but sometimes we do have medieval cookbooks that come down to us. They locked up those spices that were so expensive and costly so that they couldn't be sort of used indiscriminately. And it's just very interesting to sort of hear about, I think it relates to a lot of our food culture today. Everyone likes, going to a restaurant is not just about eating, it's about the atmosphere, the company you're with, the environment, how the food is served on your plate. And all of this was in play. This is actually a medieval tradition, actually, of course, going back much earlier in time as well. But I think we have a lot of records of how they considered food in the Middle Ages, and just how they obtained it, how they enjoyed it, as we do today.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Such a nuanced answer. We have some questions from our audience. This is either Jan or Jan. Apologies for if I mispronounced your name. Could you talk about where below the salt comes from?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I'm guessing that's a familiar phrase, but I'm not familiar with it. Are you, Joy?
I'm actually not familiar with it either. And I'm curious if this person could illuminate for us maybe where they've heard it, or if it's colloquial from a certain region. I'm very interested in that.
I mean, is it something like below the surface or beneath the surface? If it indicates that, I mean, that might have to do with how salt is harvested.
Yes.
It's just a guess.
I think that's a good guess, because I haven't heard of it before, but that does sound like nearly spot on. I have another question from Lindsay Rowe. Other than salt, were there other spices that may have been common on a medieval table?
Absolutely, yes. So I mentioned a few of them, things that would have been harvested in places like China and India and the Middle East, many of which we use today, some of which have fallen out of use, but things like cinnamon, cardamom, ginger, mace, saffron as well. All of these things would have had to have been imported generally. There were some local spices, but there's a lot of publications on medieval cookbooks. Even people have attempted to update medieval recipes so you can actually cook from them. I have quite a few of these cookbooks myself. So that's kind of fun to do if you're, need a good quarantine activity. This is, you should certainly try to consult some of those sources. There's lots of great books out there that you can pick up today and try out some of the recipes. Actually, it's kind of fun to do it sometimes, because often they lack a lot of detail that we might want in a recipe, where we tend to have very detailed recipes today. They might just say, take a chicken and cook it till it's hot. Well, how exactly do you want me to do that? So you kind of have to fill in the blanks, but some are more detailed and you can actually cook them from start to finish, or just have a fun experiment. If you're more of an experimental cook, you might have a better chance at making a successful medieval recipe.
I love that. And I didn't know that about recipes from the medieval period, and kind of how we see recipes now. That seems like it's program that we should maybe consider. So, Jan or Jan has a just a quick update. In etiquette, less important people are seated below the salt.
Oh, I see. So is it about where the salt lives on the table and sort of proximity, I would imagine, to the host? And I would imagine the salt would be sort of closer to the host. Oh, that's great. Actually, that's certainly true. I mean, I think, again, salt was also a rather expensive item. Spices even more so, I think, because there were European sources of salt. But that would make complete sense because, of course, salt was a more expensive commodity, and if you're not close to it and it's a stationary salt cellar, you're not going to be able to get very much of it on your food, are you? So you don't rank among the dinner guests as much as some others. That's great. Now I learned something. Thank you.
I love that when our audience can inform us on new things. I have a question about entremet. Do you know of any other entremet out there, or there's some that stick out to you, or a one that sticks out to you that you could share?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots. I mean, an entremet could sort of, the evolution of that term kind of, it changed from time to time. So, there's some that were, like I said, like that sort of entertainment. They were also sort of sculptures on the table that could be considered entremet. So entire palaces sort of made out of sugar. This came later in time. At the same time that my exhibition at the Getty was on view, there was a refresh of another show curated by my colleague Marcia Reed. It was called the Edible Monument, and I would encourage you to go. It has its own website. You should look it up. And she talks a lot about these later sort of post-medieval entremet, which were sometimes, like I said, entertainment, but also these kind of very sculptural, made from food, but you wouldn't actually eat it. So it's sort of a
contest now.
Oh,
in the Midwest, but really all over the nation. Butter carving.
Yes, butter carving, ice carvings. These are things that still appear at, say, weddings today in America. It's I think we all like to play with our food, right?
We do as adults. I think that we adults don't like to play with our food. One of our resident curators, Lisa, has a really great anecdote. In the Satyricon, I hope I pronounced that properly, a Roman novel, there is also a scene where live birds fly out unexpectedly when cutting into a roasted pig, which reminds me of Sing a Song of Sixpence Story. Lots of great parallels with ancient banqueting culture, though our ships were often in the shape of lamps rather than salt cellars.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Yeah. And Lisa gave a wonderful talk about Roman wine practices and drinking. And, this is, as I said, I sort of caught myself because I've been very focused on the medieval period. But of course, there's lots of very interesting studies of dining culture in various cultures before the Middle Ages. So this is something that I think it's really just interesting to see some of these traditions that get passed down to us, and some of them then don't. I did not know the pig story, though. That's very interesting.
It's also interesting is using a cooked animal as a prop and like not eating it. It's that's such an interesting thing.
Yeah, and I mean, you can sort of think of it as sort of that was another medieval technique to sort of put, animal inside of animal inside of animal. So like your turducken of the Middle Ages. And I say this, being a vegetarian, so this makes me feel a little bit squeamish. But anyway, so that was certainly a tradition that went back to that period. And you would have had entertainers, singers, jesters, things of that sort that would have been circulating around the table during one of these very fancy banquets. So you have that happening. You have the servers come out with great fanfare with each course. I mean, this happens at a fancy meal even in America. So yeah. I see we have more questions, though, I think.
Yes, we have another comment. In medieval, this is from Sonia. In medieval Ukraine, there was a whole category of people who were traveling to harvest salt in the caverns and salt mines. They were called chumaks. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. The harvesting of the salt is so important in the area that the Milky Way is called Chumaks Way in Ukrainian. And I'm surely going to butcher that. I don't know if you are up on your Ukrainian.
Sorry, no.
Knocks away, which I think is really interesting, the importance of salt in this conversation specifically, but also, to certain cultures that
Mhm.
salt as a spice specifically was of importance and venerated.
Yeah, and I think salt isn't just for seasoning your food, it's also for preserving food as well. And if you've ever tried to preserve anything with salt, you need quite a lot of it. So this is I think why these salt mines and things of that sort were quite so important and so sought after. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, it looks like that's all we have for questions. Thank you so much to Christine for sharing some really great work with us, and just a wonderful object in the collection. It's very quirky, very cute, but also a really deep and nuanced history. I want to thank the audience for sharing their comments and their questions. And last but certainly not least, our digital team for making this all possible. We'll see you in the next program, and have a great night.
Thanks.